Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're diving into a genuinely fascinating game theory paper that reveals exactly why third-party security systems fail when attackers manipulate them. And, more importantly, we'll see how defenders can actually survive the chaos. You know, if you've ever relied on a commercial threat intelligence feed or an intrusion detection system, you are essentially playing a high-stakes invisible game. So we're going to break down the exact mathematical breaking points of that game using some really incredible simulations.
So to really understand this game, we've got to talk about the Kibitzer. It's a brilliant term borrowed right from the paper's title, and it actually originates from Yiddish folk vocabulary. Basically, a Kibitzer is a spectator who has absolutely no stake in a game, yet offers unsolicited advice anyway. They aren't playing, they definitely weren't hired to mediate, but there they are, sitting right on the sidelines telling you exactly what you should do.
And here's where it gets wild. You can map that nosy spectator perfectly onto modern cybersecurity. Think about it. A commercial intrusion detection system or a threat intel feed just sits on the sidelines. It issues alerts and warnings, sure, but it isn't actually a party to the raw contest between the hacker and your network. Its whole business model relies on looking accurate, which, believe it or not, is a completely different objective from actually protecting your specific assets. Okay, let's meet our players and figure out what makes them tick. We've got three distinct actors. First, the attacker, who obviously wants a successful breach and has to decide how much effort to spend on the attack. Then, the defender, who just wants to protect their assets and has to figure out how sensitive to be to the Kibitzer's alerts. And finally, the Kibitzer, who simply wants a reputation for accuracy so it gets trusted. But, and this is the absolute kicker, for every single one of these players, taking action costs real money. So we're looking at what the author calls a repeated stochastic game. Basically, a game of constantly evolving risks and probabilities that bind these players together. The Kibitzer gets a sweet reputational payoff for being trusted by the defender. But actually monitoring the network accurately, that costs the Kibitzer money. Meanwhile, the attacker can literally spend their own resources to jam or corrupt the Kibitzer's signal, forcing it to stay silent, even when an attack is actively happening. And the poor defender. They start out completely blind and have to learn exactly how much to trust this signal over time.
Right, so here's where the dramatic tension really ramps up. We have to ask ourselves, what actually happens to this whole delicate ecosystem if the attacker decides to aggressively spend resources to corrupt the Kibitzer's signal? Imagine the attacker forcing the threat feed to just stay silent. How does the Kibitzer react when its expensive vigilance is being completely masked? And how does the defender adapt? Well, the author built an analytical mathematical model to predict the exact threshold where this corruption hits its peak. But when they ran a full multi-agent simulation, the results were staggering. The actual system collapse is amplified a massive 3 to 4 times beyond what simple single-agent reasoning would suggest. It's a vicious cycle. As trust falls, the defender ignores the alerts. That gives the attacker more incentive to keep corrupting, which in turn drops the Kibitzer's accuracy even further. It is just a massive, destructive trust corruption feedback loop. This leads to a massive plot twist: the equilibrium collapse. Picture this. The Kibitzer's vigilance, their effort to actually give you good alerts, is perfectly stable right up until the attacker's corruption costs drop to around 0.6. But once corruption gets cheaper than that threshold, the vigilance literally plummets to absolute zero. The Kibitzer's completely stops trying. The really critical takeaway here is that cheap corruption doesn't just add a little static to the line. It completely obliterates the Kibitzer's economic incentive to even try. It's a total information unraveling, highly reminiscent of the classic market for lemons in economics. The Kibitzer realizes their expensive vigilance is just going to be silenced by the attacker anyway, so they make a cold, rational, mathematical choice to surrender. They drop their vigilance to zero, and the whole signaling system just falls apart. Okay, so knowing the whole system can just implode like that under corruption, how on earth do we, as defenders, survive? If the threat intelligence feed you are literally paying for might rationally decide to stop trying to protect you, how do you adapt your defenses without suffering catastrophic losses? When you map out the cumulative losses over, say, 1,200 rounds of this game, a really clear winner emerges. If the defender just blindly trusts the Kibitzer's alerts, the losses are absolutely staggering. But if you actively track and update that trust based on recent performance, using adaptive learning or just a simple moving average, the defender completely dominates the game and avoids those massive compounding losses.
Seriously, naive, blind trust is literally the worst strategy you can play here. Trusting an unsolicited signal blindly becomes the exact vulnerability an attacker exploits. If you just hook an intrusion detection system into your network and treat every single beep as the gospel truth without any mechanism to evaluate its ongoing accuracy, you are just handing the attacker a direct vector to manipulate your defenses.
Now, you might be thinking you need a PhD and some massive complex mathematical model to calculate exactly how much to trust these feeds. Not quite. The author actually drops a surprisingly honest caveat right in the paper. They admit that a much simpler moving average heuristic captures almost all the benefit, noting this as evidence against overclaiming the value of complex Bayesian math. In short, you absolutely don't need complex math to win this game.
So, practically speaking, winning comes down to 3 incredibly straightforward rules. Number 1, never ever blindly trust third-party threat feeds. Number 2, always anticipate that the attacker has the capability to corrupt that feed. And 3, to actually manage your trust, just track the last 40 rounds of advice using a basic moving average. It works almost as well as highly sophisticated probability calculations. It's practical, it's implementable, and it is highly effective.
When you map out the exact scenarios where a trust-managed Kibitzer gives you an edge, it's pretty revealing. Imagine comparing the maximum accuracy the Kibitzer can hit against how expensive it is for the attacker to corrupt things. In almost every scenario where you track the score, utilizing the Kibitzer improves the defender's position. And the better the maximum accuracy, the bigger your competitive advantage.
But there is one vital exception to all of this. The only time the Kibitzer isn't worth having at all, even if you're perfectly managing your trust, is when the corruption cost hits near zero. If it is practically free for the attacker to endlessly manipulate the feed without burning any of their own money, the signal is dead. Period. But anywhere outside of that extreme scenario, a trust-managed feed is an absolute asset.
What's really great is that this holds up under pressure. When you look at robustness checks across all kinds of different baseline attack costs, the advantage of adaptive trust learning stays incredibly strong. It doesn't matter if the underlying attack is super cheap or crazy expensive for the hacker, the defender's advantage consistently grows. This proves that tracking reliability isn't just some niche tactic, it is a fundamentally robust strategy across the board.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with a question to chew on. Think about the intelligence feeds, the automated alerts, the shiny security systems you rely on every single day. Are they actually accurate right now, or has the cost of corruption dropped so low that the Kibitzer has simply stopped trying? Next time an alert pops up, ask yourself, are you applying blind trust or are you keeping score? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and definitely keep questioning the signals.